And then thanks everybody for joining us for today's session. We just want to ask for permission to record to share this session.
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Fine with me.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Rockford University Brownback Seminar. I would like to start by thanking Rockford University, the philanthropy and alumni engagement, and everyone who joins us today. Thank you for supporting the series. Brownback series are organized by Professor Marilyn Loyola and myself. We have Professor Mary Weeks Baxter today. She is Andrew Sherritt College Professor and Director of Jane Addams Center. The title of her presentation is Jane Addams at Rockford Female Seminary, a Catalyst for Change. Please join me welcoming Professor Weeks Baxter.
Thank you all. I am thrilled to be able to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Lanette Grate. She is our inaugural speaker for the Jane Addams Center Visiting Scholar Series at Rockford University. Professor Grate is senior lecturer in the Department of Communications at Central Arkansas University in Conway, Arkansas. Winner of the Rachel Carey Award for Courage in the Teaching of Writing, Professor Grate co-created the University of Central Arkansas Demand Justice Student Panel, which raises awareness about the issue of wrongful conviction. In 2008, she co-founded Arkansas Demands Justice, a nonprofit organization that promotes criminal justice reform in Arkansas. Her scholarly work on Jane Addams began back when she was working on her dissertation at the University of Western Michigan, where she wrote on Jane Addams and the foundationalist fallacy coming to voice at Rockford Female Seminary. And I point to one of her more recent articles too, Jane Addams, Citizen Writers in a Wider Justice. This article was published in a collection of essays entitled Jane Addams in the Classroom. And in the article, she looks at the ways in which Jane Addams' legacy can be a part of students' educational experience and instill within them the values of social justice and activism. Please help me in welcoming Professor Lanette Grate to Rockford University. Thanks so much for being here, Lanette.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today and giving me this opportunity to talk about Jane Addams. I found a kindred spirit in Jane Addams, and she has inspired me as a writer and a teacher and an activist, and to be in the presence of others who admire this great woman and are dedicated to preserving her legacy and bringing her ideals into the 21st century is just such an honor for me to be with you. So thank you so much. Jane Addams, in this quote, actually begged us not to forget the old seminary. And so I decided to devote some of my scholarship to doing just that. I investigated rhetoric at Rockford Female Seminary, and I've chosen Jane's rhetorical resistance that she exercised here at the seminary as the focus of my talk today. Well, before I met Jane Addams, whenever I heard the word seminary, this is what would pop into my mind. And even though this is a fictitious seminary, you know, there was a lot going on there with poison mushrooms and romantic girl crushes and things like that. But the more I looked into Jane Addams Seminary, the real one, the more I found a bit of intrigue going on here as well. Maybe not on the level of Clint Eastwood, but close. And the intrigue that I was interested in involved language and the way language was being used at the seminary in relation to power relations. So before I get to that, let me just remind everyone, if we need reminding, what a wonderful woman Jane Addams was. She was a humanitarian, a feminist, social worker, educator, author, public intellectual, founder of Hull House, president of the ILPF, second female recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, But for me, for the 4 years that I really devoted my study to rhetoric at Rockford, she was first and foremost Jane Addams, 17 to 20-year-old seminary student from Cedarville, who just exuded chutzpah all 4 years. And she was no ordinary student. She was first in her class, president of her class all 4 years, one of the few and then the only students in the classical track, editor of the school paper, valedictorian, and all of her accomplishments are noteworthy. But what interested me the most as I studied her time at the seminary was this ongoing conflict over language that she engaged in with none other than seminary principal Anna Peck Sill. Because missing from that list of accomplishments I just rattled off is the one that Anna Sill valued above all others. And that was to become a professing evangelical Christian. At the seminary, in the words of Bartleby the scrivener, Jane Addams preferred not to, and she repeatedly declined Miss Sill's efforts to save her soul. So this created quite a conundrum for Miss Sill, because how could this student who represented the very best of seminary educational and mental values in her scholastic achievements and her leadership ability, how could she be unconverted and so lacking in what Miss Sill considered to be the best value, the moral value of being a Christian woman? So here is the problem in a nutshell. Anna Peck Sill, for all her wonderful qualities, she was obsessed with religion, and she was committed to using the seminary to proselytize for that religion. And to this extent that she made religious discourse and aims normative at the seminary. It's kind of similar to the way whiteness in American society is made normative in racial ideology. When you believe that your system is superior to all others, and that you create through the way you are using language, then your system becomes the language of authoritarianism with corresponding beliefs of entitlement and segregation, and even demonizing those who use language differently. So as an unprofessed Christian at the seminary, Jane was a target her entire 4 years. Her struggle to remain unconverted, it's not unlike the struggle Freire talks about in speaking of the oppressed and the oppressor. Because the predetermined place for women at the seminary at the time was to inhabit separate spheres from men. The goal was to be a religious, useful female, either a mother or a missionary wife. And those were about the only two choices presented to you back at the time Jane was here. But Jane wanted to write her own story, and she wanted to be author of her own narrative. In other words, the identity that she wanted to create was at odds with the identity Miss Sill wanted to create for her. And in this resistance that she exercised at the seminary, she came to understand a vital truth. The religious system that was operating here, it depended on you buying into and never questioning the dominant discourse. And Jane just couldn't do that. She saw this discourse system as only one option among many. And she felt that language could be constructed and resisted. Reality could be otherwise, she believed. And she made a comment about most of her classmates at the seminary. She said they accept it as if there's no other course of action. And she was confused about this, why so many didn't question. With the realization that language systems are man-made, came the permission Jane needed to investigate, to observe, and to analyze power at the seminary. Who held it, where it came from, who benefited, who was limited by it, and most importantly, how to challenge or resist the language of authoritarianism or absolutism. So this begs the question, how could such a professional woman like Anna Sill, who did such wonderful things for the seminary and who valued female education, how could she be complicit in a system that actually limited women to a predetermined and prescribed place and roles? Well, first of all, Anna Seal benefited from it. Her executive and curricular decisions were based on maintaining the status quo at the seminary and, of course, pleasing that all-powerful board who controlled her employment. If she lost this job as a single woman with no family, what would she do in, from 1850 to 1880? What could she do? So back to my question, why was she complicit? She benefited from it. That's my answer. Not as much as the president at Balot College or the professors there who had very nice incomes and lived in very elegant homes in the city. But she benefited from it nonetheless. She had a pretty nice job here and steady employment. So she appears unable to recognize her complicity in this language system or to stand outside it and evaluate it. But I discovered in my research that others could see that there was a problem at the seminary. And I'll just run through a couple of these. In 1855, Zilpah Grant Bannister, who was the founder of Ipswich Female Seminary in Massachusetts, she came to visit the seminary because she had made an offer that she would make the seminary her beneficiary in her will. And the board got very excited about this. Anna Seal was very excited about this because they needed money to build. This was the 1850s and they wanted to grow the campus. So they welcomed Zilpah Grant Bannister to come visit the seminary in the hopes that she would actually leave money in her will. But there is a little problem. Zilpah Grant Bannister was an advocate of learning for the joy of learning and not for grades or prizes. And after she spent a few days here observing Miss Seal, she noted that Miss Seal's policies had, quote, too much absolutism, unquote. In other words, I'm sad to say, Miss Seal was the Miss Gradgrind of female education in the West. After observing her, Zilpah Grant Bannister reported to the Board of Trustees, quote, somewhere in the structure of her mind, there are a pin or two loose, and the effects are and must be disastrous unless counteracted. What she was noting was an oppressive, legalistic environment where the girls were made to memorize copious amounts of material, and then they were drilled like parrots. That was another quote, drilled like parrots. In chapel, they were forced to sit with their hands behind their backs and their heads resting on the desk in front. And Miss Seal would say, assume the position, and they would assume this position. It just horrified Zilpah Grant Bannister. She noted that the students were under great academic and evangelical pressure, and she feared for them. And she also declined to leave Rockford Seminary any money in her will. So Miss Seal was very concerned. It also raised concerns with the Board of Trustees. And they began to question Miss Seal's credentials. Was this really the woman, that should be leading the seminary? After debating back and forth, to and fro, they decided that Miss Seal would retain her job because the board concluded that the moral education she was providing for the girls was more important than the academic. Another person who questioned the absolutism at the seminary was Rockford businessman Ralph Emerson's daughter, Adeline. She attended the seminary in 1876 as a day student. She complained to her father about the religious pressure. Adeline said at breakfast one morning, I think it's just wicked the way they go on at the seminary. They're having a revival over there, and some of the girls are sick of nervous diseases, and lots of others so nervous, they don't know what to do. I think it's just wicked. And her father was inclined to agree with his daughter. Jerusa Jones is another example of someone who mounted a little resistance here. That was a pen name of someone who was writing an editorial for the Seminary magazine. She wrote under that pen name. I'm not really sure if we even know who Jerusa Jones is. Maybe if someone does, you could tell me who she is. But she began to question some of the seminary values early. For example, she asked, why are the girls at the seminary having to provide free domestic services, such as cleaning, sweeping, washing dishes, but the boys at Balat had no such requirement and were free to study Greek and Latin and enjoy their leisure time? She suggested that the boys be set to chopping wood, planing boards, and boring holes, and building things, so that they could mirror the accomplishments that the girls were attaining. The faculty also knew something just wasn't quite right. The teachers noted it privately in a letter Sarah Anderson wrote to Jane Addams after she graduated in 1882. Anderson says, quote, I don't know as you will understand this, Jane, but in reality, Miss Sill is the only member of the faculty. The rest are hired workers or tutors. Miss Blasdell, who taught Greek and Latin, she was the head of her department, but none of the others are. So Miss Sill's authority here was pretty absolute at the seminary. And Jane is immersed in this atmosphere of legalistic, academic, and religious intensity. Now, I don't want to make Miss Sill a villain at all. And so let me tell you what she got right. She was a professional woman at a time when marriage and the mission field, as I said, were about her only options. And she was devoted to female education. In fact, she modeled Rockford Seminary after elite Eastern schools like Mount Holyoke. She wanted the Christian mothers and missionaries at the seminary to turn out to be educated so that they could raise their children to also be educated and maybe come to the seminary. So she wanted to keep a steady stream here coming to the seminary. But what she got wrong, due to her language system, she believed that there was only one divinely imposed truth, and she used language and the education system as a propaganda tool to propagate her religion and to pressure those impressionable young girls to convert to that religion. And that had lifelong effects on their future trajectories. So this was the intense religious atmosphere Jane encountered when she arrived at the school, and it went on for the entire 4 years she was here. Jane reflects, I was singularly unresponsive to all forms of emotional appeal, although I was unspeakably embarrassed when they were presented to me at close range. She found these interviews asking her to surrender to Jesus hard to endure. And as was a long series of conversations my senior year conducted by one of the most enthusiastic members of the faculty, in which the desirability of Turkey as a field of mission work was enticingly put before me. One teacher wrote in the aftermath of a month-long revival at the seminary, quote, to resist the influences for the last 4 weeks takes a terrible power of opposition. So fortunately, the young Jane Addams possessed not only mental integrity, but she also possessed that terrible power of opposition. And she was more interested in coming to narrative authority than coming to Jesus. So the conflict then, as I see it, involved a struggle over language. The closed language system at the seminary versus Jane Addams, who wanted to use language in much more vital ways, to enter a really living world. Jane never directly attacked or belittled or spoke disrespectfully of Miss Sill, but her rebellion took the form of numerous rhetorical resistances to Miss Sill's cherished ideals. The conflict can be boiled down to, does Jane surrender her voice and become a parrot for the language of authoritarianism in order to fit in and make everyone like her and maintain the status quo? Or does she insist on the right to her own voice? And that might lead her out into the world to be an effective change agent for social transformation. Well, in effect, as a speaker who used language differently, she inverted that seminary gaze back on itself. From judging her as morally lacking because she wasn't a Christian, she judged the language system as lacking. It wasn't big enough. It wasn't wide enough. It wasn't encompassing enough for Jane Addams. So I want to shout out to her teachers, and I'll do that at the end too. At the heart of her empowerment, I believe, were those teachers, her classical and literacy educators that helped her here at the seminary, from Sarah Blasdell to Sarah Anderson and Caroline Potter. If they hadn't been there in Jane's life to show her, that it was okay what she was doing, she might have caved to the seminary propaganda, and she might have perished on a foreign mission field, or died in childbirth, or spent her life taking care of George or Rollin Salisbury. So thankfully for history, she didn't. The rhetorical conflict between Miss Sill and Jane Addams, it was a battle over truth, and whose truth would prevail. And if that sounds familiar, well, I believe we're in a similar battle right now in 2021. Jane called the religious atmosphere at the seminary perverted. Those are her words. She was determined to challenge the institution, not as a radical flag burner, but in a way where she could show democratic discourse as an alternate system and a more desirable or a better way to use language. So I want to go over just a few of the things that she did here. It's just all the way through the 4 years. We would be here forever if we talked about all of them, but I have just pulled out just a few so you can get a taste of it. And some I know you're familiar with. The pledge. This occurred the very first weeks that she was at the seminary, her first year. The girls circulated a pledge that was the total opposite of the seminary pledge, which they all had to write out and sign about being obedient and good girls and whatever. In this alternative pledge that some of the girls signed, and I'm sure Jane Addams did, the pledge was to never, ever give Miss Seal what she wanted most of all, not ever to become a missionary. That was what the pledge was about. So I think the pledge shows that early on, Jane began to seek out and find other dissidents who she could, collaborate with as she exercised more and more power at the seminary. Don Quixote is a really funny one to me as a teacher, because I'm sure we've all been in those situations where we get corrected by a student and it's kind of awkward. But this happened pretty early on in Jane's tenure there too. She was in moral philosophy class with Miss Sill, and Jane corrected Miss Sill's pronunciation of Don Quixote. Miss Sill was pronouncing it Don Quixote. And so Jane just spoke right up and corrected her with the correct pronunciation. And then all the girls backed her up with laughter. And Miss Sill suspended the entire class for 2 days. But I know it's a small incident, but to me, she's correcting an authority figure. She had the courage to do that. And she showed Miss Sill there's more than one way to pronounce a word. And by extension, there may be more than one way to use language or interpret reality. And this was kind of earth-shaking. If Miss Sill could be wrong about the pronunciation of a word, then she might be wrong about some other things as well. And I think it's a precursor that imagination is going to supplant tradition here at the seminary. Marx, I know we're all familiar with that one if you're a Jane Addams fan. It's written her sophomore year. It's the allegory written for her Castilian Society, where she puts forth two options. You can either study for the love of learning or you can study for grades and teacher approval. And I think by presenting this publicly and then getting this printed in the school paper, she deflates Miss Sill's educational ethos, which was skills and drills. And she, is also showing early use of philosophical pairs, pairing them together, which we're going to see more in her adult writing. The Opm Essay I found fascinating. I'm a writing teacher, and so I was very interested in how writing was being taught at the seminary. I discovered it was taught across the curriculum. In every class, Jane wrote essays, not only in English and history, but in chemistry and science. The Opm Essay was written for Mary Holmes, her science teacher. Jane was supposed to write a science paper about the opium plant. And instead, Jane turned in a paper about the social effects of the opium trade, how devastating it was to families and societies. And Miss Holmes says, let me find my quote here. She says, I intended your essay to be more pertaining to the distinguishing characteristics of the poppy as regards petals, sepals, stamens, etc. Also in the manner of obtaining opium. And Jane demonstrates that she can be corrected by rewriting the essay for Miss Holmes, but she also demonstrates that her view is the wider, bigger view, and she published that then in the school paper. Walpurgis Night, that's an essay, little known essay. We all know Bread Givers, we all know Cassandra, those are well studied. Walpurgis Night was an essay that she wrote. And to me, it is just a direct attack on Miss Sill's view of religion. I'm going to read just a couple lines that she wrote from this essay so you get the flavor of it. Jane wrote, when Christianity was introduced in Europe, its missionaries held one soul avenging God, like Miss Sill, and condemned all other deities, not only vampires and demons, but the good as well. All the heathen gods and their beautiful mythological characters were degraded as evil. They declared there could be no white magic, but only black. She concluded by noting that almost 1 million women perished and were butchered as witches. I can just imagine Miss Sill reading this essay and her hair standing on end just a little bit. But I think the biggest revolt, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit, but the biggest revolt that I found and the biggest resistance occurred with Jane's work on the Rockford Seminary magazine. Something earth-shaking happened with the magazine Jane's sophomore year. An anonymous editorial was published decrying the social isolation at the seminary and criticizing Miss Sill openly and demanding that there be more interaction with the townspeople of Rockford. This was a direct challenge to Anna Sill because she tried to keep the girls pretty much separate from the outside world. She responded by suspending 2 of the column editors and sanctioning the editor, Mary Downs. But this incident was known among the girls as the Great Revolt, the Revolution, the insurrection. Revolt was definitely afoot. Evidently, the editors of the paper had planned sort of a 2-pronged assault. So one was to reach the townspeople, to bring them into the seminary, to meet the girls and to be more involved. And the other was to reach out to other colleges and male and female colleges and establish a cultural and a scholarly and an academic exchange with them. So without asking Miss Sill's permission, Jane, the next year as a junior, she became editor of the Clippings and Exchange column. And she began to put that idea of reaching out and interaction with the elite colleges into motion. She created a column called College Societies, and she began networking with these colleges like Colby, Vassar, Yale, Wellesley. There's a whole list of them. It became a dialogic exchange where she was writing letters and corresponding with the editors of the paper. She was receiving essays that had been published in the paper, and she was then in turn publishing them in their paper. She invited discussion among these colleges with topics of the day of interest to college students, like should there be literary societies, should there be debating societies? And she invited them to lend their voices and join in, and she would publish it then in the magazine. Jane was not suspended, nor was she sanctioned because by Miss Sill, because she had figured out how to handle Miss Sill. Don't write an editorial criticizing her. Instead, just go ahead and do it. Do the change. That was what Jane figured out her senior year. Just do it. And then if it works, all the praise is coming in and it gets reflected back on Miss Sill, and it's too late for anything to change. So that is what she did as editor. Her senior year, massive changes come to the paper. The masthead was changed. She's beginning to credit the editors. She got rid of the alumni department, which was always featured prominently on the first page. She replaced it with the literary department. She still invited alums to write in, but she said, please submit articles on practical matters. She wanted to try to get rid of all the mission field religious propaganda that had previously been printed. Other things she did this year, she organized a fair with food booths, arts and crafts to raise money to pay off the debt the magazine was in, and she succeeded. Not only did she pay off the debt, but she got a surplus, invested it in the bank, and it began to draw interest, because this was one way Miss Seal was able to control them and the editors, was by saying, well, you're in debt, we should just get rid of it. But now the seminary the magazine was earning its own money. Jane Addams, as editor, her senior year, she agreed with the insurrection that had occurred previously her sophomore year. And those editors would write to her, they'd long graduated, but they would write to her and praise her and say, you are accomplishing things that we couldn't. Miss Seal is letting you get away with things here. By removing the religious rhetoric from the paper and replacing it with philosophical and critical analysis, I think Jane won a major victory here. And another way, just one last way that she changed the paper was her editorials. All of them were just brilliantly critical, as James Weber Lynn says. One of them, and I'm going to close with this, it was about the conservative element that was at work at the seminary. And it's really a very veiled attack on Miss Seal. And she tells the girls, don't be afraid. If you have an opinion that's different, don't let this conservative element silence you or shut you down. Be courageous. Don't be a coward. Speak up your truth, and don't be afraid to do that. So I find that editorial very effective right now too in 2021. Fear of the conservative element, fear of the reaction, the different opinion. But anyway, all these changes were huge, and lest Miss Seal ever take offense, Jane often ended her editorials with, far be it from us to stir up an insurrection. But that was exactly what she was doing. So just a few takeaways here. Critical education matters. Education that involves inquiry, problem posing, problem solving, the ability to evaluate argumentative claims, sympathetic imagination, the ability to resist persuasion, especially when you know you're right, the ability to question a popular opinion, ability to use writing to create new possibilities and understanding, the ability to see that meaning shifts depending on the communicative interaction. Critical education is so important, and I believe that's what Jane Addams helped move the seminary toward as it became a college. She says, passive resistance of mind is clinging to an individual conviction. Best moral training I received at Rockford College. All right, another shout out to those transformative teachers. Teachers matter. I think they need to be intellectuals. Her coming to voice at Rockford so depended on these heroic teachers and their commitment to rhetoric and language use. If they had gotten in the crosshairs of Miss Seal, they could have lost their job too. But they plugged along, and very important, these heroic teachers that she had: Caroline Potter, Sarah Anderson, Sarah Blasdell. So in conclusion, the greatest lessons Jane Addams learned right here at Rockford Female Seminary, it wasn't how to read Greek or Latin or how to write college essays in standard English. It certainly wasn't domestic servitude like Miss Seal wanted. Most powerful lesson she learned, and which guided her throughout her entire life, was how to maintain her mental integrity above all else while questioning and challenging a powerful, centralizing, dominant discourse system that wanted to define her and limit her. By resisting, she was able to create for herself an identity as a speaker of democratic and collaborative discourse who went out into the world and made transformative change. And we're so glad she did. And this is the way Jane ended many of her editorials, Sila, let it be. And so that is the conclusion of my talk, and I welcome your questions.
You can get the questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, Lanette. So we have about 15 minutes for questions, maybe a little bit less. Are there any questions in the audience?
That was great. Thank you so much. Could you talk a little bit about, and you might have done this, my internet shut down for a second, but could you talk a little bit about just how she was received on campus and perhaps even by some of the higher ups? Was the board aware of her activities at all? Her classmates? What was the?
Oh yeah, good question. Yeah, well, her father was on the board. So you know, I think that may be one reason Ms. Still tread a little softly with Jane, and she never got suspended or sanctioned. How she was received by her classmates? Oh, very, very popular. She was a leader among those girls. There's a famous quote by one of her classmates who said, you know, there's always some kind of ozone going on in her room. And anytime we could get in there and talk with Jane, they loved doing that. And they show their respect for her by electing her president of her class all 4 years. Editor of the paper is just a huge honor, you know, to be an editor of a school paper. Oh, she was also president of her society, her literary society. So yeah, they respected her. And I just to add, I would imagine they too were wishing that they could go after Miss Sill the way that Jane was and got away with it. I was telling Mary that in chapel, Jane would often read a book, and Miss Sill would just let her do it because why? She didn't want to tangle with her. I don't know.
And you all might know the portrait of Anna Peck Sill up there in Forest Cool as a little bit of a reference for you too. Lanette, can you tell more about Caroline Potter?
Yeah, Caroline Potter she was a graduate of Rockford Seminary, and then began her career as a teacher there. And she taught history and English, and it was one of Jane's favorite teachers. And as I said, I'm a writing teacher, so I was very curious how Caroline Potter approached writing. She assigned lots of essays, and they drafted. They did revisions, and Ms. Potter writes in pencil in the margins notes to the girls on how to improve the paper. I was telling you, Mary, she never corrects their grammar or mechanics ever. And there were a lot. She never mentions those. It's always trying to get the girls to think deeply. I think in one essay, Jane said something about God's powers were limited or something. And Miss Potter writes, that God's powers are not. He's God. They're not unlimited. And so Jane would then go back and redraft and try to reword that sentence or that section. Oh, and also, I'll just throw this in. Mary and I were over at the library, and we were looking at the little notes, the books that Jane had from those classes. And I recalled that in Caroline Potter's class, English class, the girls were introduced to female writers, just equally with male writers. And so a lot of them I didn't know that, you know, some were well known, Louisa May Alcott, George Eliot, I see those in the notes. But some were just evidently writers that Caroline Potter knew at the time.
I have a question. Maybe this is more for lunch or later. I'm thinking about, I'm not really very familiar with what has been published of Addams' writings. If I want to introduce students to some of the things she wrote as editor of the paper or things like that, I wonder, this is maybe for Joanna too, is the best way to come to the archives to schedule a meeting to actually get in there? Are there any critical editions of all of these things? Is there a lot of basically unpublished work that's sitting there in our archives from her pen?
In my view, I think there's a lot of unpublished work, especially on that Rockford Seminary magazine. Just compiling all her editorials together would be interesting. I know they're on probably the best way would be to do the microfilm. I mean, they're all on there. If you're going to do a research or scholarly study of them.
It just sounds so fun to have them all in a book, to read all of that at once.
Yeah, it was fun today when I was over there in the archives. I was in heaven, just holding in my hand the Rockford Seminary magazine that Jane Addams had made all these changes to, these galvanic changes for senior year. I was actually, paging through and noting them. So quite exciting.
So,
Kristen, you have a question?
Oh, Stephanie, go ahead.
If I may, thank you so much. There's a great deal here I didn't know, and I've been with Rockford College University for several years. But I was especially surprised at how early in her college career here, she seemed so smart institutionally. How did she learn to be such an effective, cagey, clever political actor so early?
Don't you think that's from her dad, her father?
Well, that's what I wondered, if there's any, if she mentions it, or if there's any, did they talk?
Oh yeah,
Did
they
she get
talked all the
advice
time, and
about
there's
how
lots
to do things?
lots of letters back and forth. When she was under this pressure these 4 years to convert, I mean, it was bad. It was really, really bad. And she was beginning to suffer emotionally. And she had a conversation with her father, John Addams. And she said, what do I do? What do I do? Should I just cave or what? And that he's the one that said, no, your mental integrity is the most important thing. And you must not acknowledge something as truth if you do not believe it is true. That would be the worst thing. So he advised her to not convert during those 4 years. So I would think she got it from her father. Anybody join in here? Anybody jump into this conversation? There's been a lot of, I think, scholarship on those early influences. Mary and I were talking about her Latin education in high school, at the public school in Cedarville. She came to Rockford already knowing Latin and already transcribing. So,
Catherine is asking if, she says, I wonder if Mary Ashby Cheek ever said anything about Sill. And then she also says, wonder also if Rockford University would support publishing more of her work. That's not.
Is that in the chat? I have a little.
Yeah, that's in the chat. That's in the
Okay.
chat.
It seems like Sill way more different in her direction and institution than Ms. Mary Ashby Cheek, who's so encouraging her students with other schools. Mary Cheek ever said anything about so? Okay, so I'm not familiar with Mary Ashby Cheek. Was she? Is she the president after Sill?
She was president in the 1940s. Early 50s.
Oh, so quite a ways. Yeah, no, I think once Miss Sill died in what was that 87 that Miss Sill died, I believe, the college then began this big sweeping change. Right after Jane Addams graduated, women were put on the board. Jane was put on the board. Anna Sill was put on the board. And who did we decide, Mary? Who else was on? A couple others were on the board. And so it began to change direction. But really, after Miss Sill died and her control was gone, it became a real college, liberal arts.
Kristen has a question.
So we have a question. We actually have a hand up. One of our other professors of English, Kristen Ravel, has a question.
Hi, I know that there's not a ton of students in this talk, but I was wondering, given all the work and research you've done on Jane Addams' kind of feminist rhetorical resistance, what advice would you give to students nowadays who are trying to create institutional change against injustices in the university?
Oh yeah, well, read Jane Addams. She offers such a great model of not being a compiler of knowledge, but actually getting out there into the arena and fighting for what you believe in. And I think the beauty of Jane Addams too is she didn't advocate debate. She didn't advocate argument. She advocated really listening and hearing from all different viewpoints, and then trying to work together with people that you disagree with. I mean, what a novel idea for 2021, right? But no, Jane Addams pushes us out into the world. I mean, she's very much progressive that way, that it's not, your education is meant to equip you to be able to go out and challenge any injustice anywhere in your community or in the world that you see. And that's kind of her vision of what education should be doing. So I would introduce a young woman to Jane Addams. I think they would find a wonderful role model in her.
Solid recommendation for faculty as well. So we're all in this.
Other questions or comments for Lanette? Lots of comments on the chat down there. Hold on.
Mary, this is Marcy. Can you just talk a little bit more about the Visiting Scholar program? You said this is the first Visiting Scholar. What's the vision for that moving forward?
Thank you, Marcy, for that question. The vision going forward is that we have a visiting scholar or artist once a year. And I see this year too as perhaps in some ways, coming out of COVID, attempting to have the visiting scholar on campus is going to be but the vision is to engage of the important legacy of Jane Addams, and also too perhaps to think about how Jane Addams crosses disciplines too, and has had such an impact across the board in all areas that the disciplines on our campus touch. So moving forward too, I have ideas of where I'd like to see us headed in the next few years. And I really appreciate Lanette being here as the inaugural visiting scholar. Thank you for that question, Marcy. A good plug for the series.
We're also excited on the Brown Bag series and to have this be a regular part of our fall series. So that's an exciting addition to programming on campus in general. So thank you. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah.
Any final comments? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Lanette, for being here and for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
It's been an honor to have you here. I hope I get to meet you on campus this week when I'm there again. I hope everyone has a great afternoon and stay safe. And thank you again for supporting the series. Thank you, Mary, as well, and to the Jane Addams Center.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Lanette.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Lanette, may I ask you a very naive question? So, do you hear me okay?
Yeah, I have to get close to the screen for you, but go ahead.
Okay, so which book of Jane Addams would you recommend for as an introduction?
Oh, what book by Jane Addams?
Probably
20 Years at Hull House.
Okay.
But I think I got introduced to her. I think I read Peace and Bread in Time of War first. Is kind of how I got introduced to her.
Peace and Bread in Time of War.
Peace and Bread in Time of War, and it
Okay.
was right. I was in graduate school, and we were you know, with Iran, Iraq, or, you know, whatever, the 9/11 things. And so I was very impressed with her being a pacifist and not wanting to get into a war. That's how I got introduced to her. But 20 years at Hull House is also just, that'll give you a really good introduction to Jane Addams.
Which war is this? Is it the First War?
World War I. She was
Oh,
a pacifist.
Okay.
With 20 years at Hull House, you also get the chapter about Rockford Female Seminary too. So it's really fascinating how she describes her time here.
If you pick one of those, Mary, which one would you pick? Would you recommend at least?
Well, I would start with 20 years.
Okay.
Because since we're here at Rockford, that's the obvious first connection to make.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thanks you guys so much for hosting this series.
Thank you for joining us. That was really
Absolutely.
a great honor for us, right, Marilyn?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad we got that last question, Orhan, into the recording, even though most people have dropped off the recording at this point, but we did have that. So we can go ahead and close it one more time.
Oh, we didn't close it. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's good. We'll go ahead and close the recording now. Thank you all
Okay,
again for being here. Oops.